And what is that behind you, if I can ask?
I think it's just a regular, I mean, a random park. I
Yeah,
can't remember, possibly
yeah.
Shanghai, but not, I'm not 100% sure. Yeah, I think it's
When
probably.
I was Shanghai in
Uh-huh.
2017, I remember being really, really impressed by uh, the way that the public parks were
Mhm.
kept. That the parks in Shanghai, there was one I went to, especially in the former French concession,
Yeah.
which I was clearly laid out in a Western style, but it had been maintained beautifully.
Mhm.
China has one of the greatest gardening traditions,
Yeah.
I have to say. And I think I told you I went to Suzhou
Hmm.
and I visited the garden, or what's it called? Of the well, in English we call it the humble administrator,
Uh-huh. I know, that's a famous one.
but I
Yeah.
suspect that yes, I suspect that in China it's
Uh-huh.
again. I've long since discovered English translations of Chinese names are often give an Orientalist quality,
Yeah. Okay.
which really is not there in the original. But
Mhm.
I have to say, I thought it was one of the most beautiful places on earth that I have ever visited, and in fact, Suzhou altogether made a tremendous impression. Um, I didn't go to any of the restaurants in Suzhou because we were only had a short time. But I've also told the cuisine there is
Very.
marvelous.
Yeah.
But Suzhou is beautiful,
Mhm.
and the gardens in Suzhou, the garden that I saw was amazing, and the house. Actually, people never talk about the house, but it was very interesting to see, an old Chinese house of obviously, somebody who was, former official, presumably, or somebody like that. And as I said, the whole impression was just extraordinary. Anyway, there we go. That's what I wanted to
Yeah.
say.
Yeah, actually, I think I was also in Shenzhen for a few days. Shenzhen,
Yeah,
Shanghai, they all put a lot of effort for the public parks. I think one of the projects
yeah.
I saw in Shenzhen is they want to combine like five parks so that you could walk,
Oh,
you
right.
know, all through all five parks that, and I think at one point Shanghai was also thinking something similar that they were thinking if it's
Interesting.
possible. I mean, it's a long process, I mean, long project that they want to
Yeah,
eventually contact,
yeah,
connect all the parks in
yeah.
Shanghai. So you could just essentially walk through all the parks in
Well,
principle.
that would be a beautiful idea. I'll
Yeah.
tell you one thing that Shanghai does, which took me back to my childhood, which is that, especially in the former French concession, but in many other places, somebody planted a lot of London plane trees.
Mhm.
So a lot of the trees, the streets, are avenues. Now, London plane trees, as the name implies, originated in London. We have lots of them here in London, but for reasons that have never been satisfactorily explained, in London, the authorities, sometime in the early 1980s, started to clip them so that in the summer, they'd basically stumps giving off a few green leaves. Whereas in Shanghai, just as I remember from my childhood, the
Hmm.
trees are left to grow properly in the summer. So they go up and
Mhm.
then they curve together, and you have these beautiful green lanes that you walk through, which of course protects you from the sun.
Yeah.
London used to be exactly like that,
Mhm.
but I'd forgotten completely what it was like, and it was going to Shanghai that maybe reminded me of it. So I don't know why the British do this. What happened? It was never discussed, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah.
Probably something to do with saving money, I guess. Not collecting the leaves or something of that kind. But it transforms the atmosphere in the summer because, as I said, you have
Yeah.
the shade from the trees, and it cools, and
Mhm.
it creates a wonderful microclimate, and of course it reduces pollution because
Yeah.
London plane trees are very good at absorbing pollution. And there we go. That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah.
Um, After all the horrors that we're about to discuss, it's always a relief to talk about these things. As I said, you don't appreciate, people in China don't appreciate it, but I mean, China's become an oasis
Yeah.
of peace and calm. And for the record, there was an article that appeared a few days ago in the Daily Telegraph, which is perhaps the most anti-Chinese newspaper in Britain, and that's against tough competition. Anyway, somebody went there from the Telegraph to China, and he came away absolutely enthralled and said, you know, I've been here. I can tell you for an absolute fact, this is the country of the future. And I could see why he would think this. I'm surprised the editors let it pass, by the way. It didn't survive very long on the front page, but anyway.
Okay. Yes, let's talk about all the horrors. Now, by the way, actually, some Chinese citizens do understand that they do appreciate that right now China is peace and stable, you know, and not only because China is so dominant in Asia, so it's actually bring the peace and stability to the whole Asia. It's not just, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's absolutely true. It's the most peaceful region in the world.
Yeah.
Look what we've managed in Europe and the Middle East, and what we're going to do in the Middle East, which is going to make it even worse. I mean, it's just beyond reason what's going on.
Yeah. So let's start there. It's so, like you said, it's a horrendous now what's going on. China, Russia, US, they have all been asking their citizens to leave both Iran and Israel. So, and then some rich Israelis are chartering boats to Cyprus. That's the latest report I saw. Does it mean an all-out war is about to break out?
Yes, I think I mean, my impression is that the Israeli cabinet, Prime Minister Netanyahu, has been spoiling for a fight for at least a year. He's been trying to set up the situation for an attack on Iran since about April of last year, when he first bombed the Iranian embassy in Damascus, and then he assassinated the political head of Hamas in Tehran. And he came to Washington in August, and he made an incredibly belligerent speech. And I think what basically held him back for a few weeks was the American election, because neither the Democrats or on the eve of the election, because they know that the American people do not want a war in the election. I've just seen opinion polls, by the way, and they show a very substantial majority of Americans who do not want the United States to be in a war with Iran. But anyway, so then the election happened. Trump was elected. The Israelis came and said, let's start this attack on Iran. Now, Trump, as he often does, dithered for a few months. He tried to get his big deal. The deal was more difficult than he expected, because the Iranians have their own views about various things, and they don't trust the United States, as they're perfectly right to do, and they certainly don't trust Israel. So about 2 weeks ago, he had this meeting with this extremely dangerous hardline neocon figure, Mark Levin, and I could see at that moment the alarm bells starting to ring across some of his movement. Anyway, he clearly then agreed that there should be an Israeli attack on Iran. My own sense is that probably what happened was that Netanyahu and all of these people lied to him and said this attack will be easy. The regime in Iran is very unpopular. If we strike, it will collapse. The level of ignorance Americans have about Iran is off the scale. I don't know whether you saw, there was an interview that Ted Cruz gave to Tucker Carlson, in which it turned out that Ted Cruz doesn't even know the size of Iran's population, which for the record is 92 million. Anyway, they attacked Iran. Trump, as he always does. Well, first of all, they had this ridiculous cover story that this was a unilateral Israeli action, and the United States was not involved, which is absurd. Then Trump, seeing what he thought was the great success of the Israeli army, so he came out and made all kinds of statements saying, you know, this has been a great success, and why didn't the Iranians take the deal that I was offering? What deal? I mean, you know, we were in the middle of a negotiation. No deal was on the table. I mean, they were negotiating positions, but that was all. And then, of course, about a day or so ago, it became clear that Iran was not going to collapse, and they were hitting targets in Israel. And the Israelis and others came and said, look, it's clear that Israel can't finish this. So we need the United States to come in as well. And you can see that Trump didn't expect that. And he's been in a furious rage ever since. And he went to the G7 meeting and he walked out of the G7 meeting after having only the perfunctory conversations with people there. He got into a row with Macron, which is ridiculous. He stormed back to Washington. He's having all the meetings with his top officials. He's still dithering, but inevitably, sooner or later, he's going to attack Iran because that's the position he's been maneuvered into. I mean, we are dealing with a president who listens and follows the advice of the last person he speaks to, doesn't consult more widely, doesn't judge decisions, doesn't make policy, changes his mind from one day to the next. So 1 week, Putin is crazy. The next day, Putin is my best friend. I mean, it's just impossible to work with this man.
Yes, one of the questions I was going to ask you, because I'm very puzzled by it. We talked about this before that Trump used to. I mean, I thought that he's very reluctant to get into a war with Iran. And because of that, he even fired Mike Waltz, his national security advisor. And also for a while, he had a very bad relationship with Netanyahu, right? They barely talk to each other and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then it seems like I mean clearly the U.S. has been on board. I mean ever since Israel's attack on Iran, and then, of course multiple assassinations as well.
Yeah.
So now you're saying that he had a conversation with Mark Levin. Is that what's affected?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I think so. I mean, I'm taking this from Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson found out that Mark Levin had been to the White House and was extremely upset and alarmed by that, and wrote a very, very strong piece on X, saying that this was disastrous and would lead to disaster. Because I don't know if you know Mark Levin and listen to him. I mean, the man is so anti-Iranian that it's off the scale, and his language is, over the last couple of weeks, has become increasingly incoherent as he writes about Iran. But I mean, clearly, there's been a concerted push by people like Mark Levin to get the United States involved in a war with Iran, and Trump weakly went along with it because I think he was told it would be easy. This is a unpopular regime that will easily collapse. That's the narrative that's been spread all across the neocon parts of the media, if I can put it like this, that they're definitely heading for a nuclear bomb. Don't listen to what Tulsi Gabbard and your intelligence community is saying. Listen to what we are saying. You'll get the big win. Iran will collapse. You'll be the great hero. You'll be Napoleon or Julius Caesar or whatever, the great new American president who's achieved this great win. And Trump fell for it because, as I said, he doesn't consult. He doesn't apparently listen to his intelligence briefs. He doesn't sit down with Tulsi Gabbard, who does the daily brief. He doesn't speak to her. She speaks to Vance, apparently. I mean, I have that from an absolutely reliable source, if I can say so. He doesn't listen to what his intelligence people are saying. He doesn't listen to what anybody's saying, but he just follows the advice, as I said, of the last person he speaks to.
Yeah, I'm sure Mark Levin has a lot of influence on Trump, but there's also some other people, including Tucker Carlson also had a conversation with Steve Bannon. They were talking about this meeting in Camp David in the weekend of June 8th and 9th that Trump had with his national security team. Now, I think I have the list of the people who were there. They were talking about that. And one thing that Steve Bannon pointed out was Tulsi Gabbard was not in that meeting, which is interesting.
Exactly.
Yeah, what are you talking about? What's in there was Vance was there, but Vance, he's not going to have a fight with any of the others. So Rubio was there, Hegseth was there, and then John Radcliffe, the CIA director, who is another hawk. Stephen
Yeah.
Miller, the former chief of staff, White House chief of staff, another hawk. Also,
Yeah.
former National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien, so another hawk.
Yeah,
Now
absolutely.
you see,
Abs-
so all the hawks were there in that meeting, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Exactly. That's exactly what happened. So you can see that you can see exactly what happened. They tell you, you're being weak. You're letting the Iranians pull the wool over your eyes. The Israelis are primed and ready to go. All they need is your green light. And as I said, we will win. I remember Netanyahu coming to Congress last August and saying that, that if we
Mhm.
hit, if, the lesson is that if we strike, we win.
Yeah.
And so that's what he was persuaded. That's what he was talked into doing. As I said, Vance was probably the only person there in the room who might have suggested weakly, because
Mhm.
that's unfortunately the reality of Vance. Like he was opposed to the attack on the Houthis, but he went along with the majority. You remember the discussion? It's
Yeah.
exactly the same here. So, and as you rightly said, Tulsi Gabbard is excluded.
Yeah, yeah, that's Steve Bannon pointed that out, like he's not there. Well, I
Yeah,
wonder whether if I were trying to convince Trump to get into this, and you're saying that they're telling him it's going to be an easy win, but also from Trump's
yeah,
perspective, I think ever since he took office, he had very little to show for in the foreign policy front, right? He was trying to
yeah.
make peace with the Russians, and the Russians didn't vouch. They want to do whatever they need to do. And he was tough. He thought he was tough on China, but it didn't work. China didn't
No.
back down. And so now maybe one of the things they were trying to convince him is, okay, we can get a victory there, quick victory with
Yeah.
Iran, and that show your force, right? Your strength, something like that. So in other words, Trump himself might also needs a quick victory as well, right?
That is exactly correct. Now, he doesn't need a quick victory in political terms, which is
Mhm.
what he doesn't seem to understand. I
Mhm.
mean, people are not going to stop voting for him in Minnesota because he's not chalked up immediately a big foreign policy win. But in his own mind and psychology, he wants to move from one win to the other. So you're
Mhm.
absolutely right. He was told by the hardliners around him, people like General Kellogg, Rubio as well. You've got to be tough with the Russians, threaten them with massive sanctions, force them to agree to freeze the conflict. The Russians said no. Then he listened to imbeciles like Peter Navarro and Stefan Moran, and these fools who told him, just push up your tariffs against China,
Mhm.
raise them sky high, and the Chinese will back down and they'll agree the big deal with you that you want. And then also raise tariffs against everybody else, and you could force them into agreeing also that they will trade with the United States, but they will cut their links with China. Of course, nothing like that happens. The Chinese call that particular bluff. None of those. You remember all those countries that were supposed to be lining up to do deals with the United States that were going to scale down their trade with China?
Mhm.
Did a single deal like that ever appear? Not one. Not a single one. Not even Britain, by the way, which is about the one country that has signed such a deal. So he's pushed into failure over that. And
Mhm.
so now they come along and they say this is where you're going to win because Iran is weak, Iran is rickety, the regime is unpopular. Let's hit it hard. The Russians won't help them, the Chinese won't help them. They're all on their own. They've lost Hezbollah, they've lost Syria. This is the moment to strike. So he goes along and weakly does it. I mean, he's a fool.
Well, but at the same time, it's not like the people who are against the war are quiet. So MAGA people and Tucker Carlson you're talking about, and Steve Bannon, they're all against it. I mean, Steve Bannon and Tucker Carlson, they had this conversation.
Yeah.
And they were both very, very unhappy about this, to say the least. Now, Tucker Carlson was saying that if Trump get us into a war with Iran, that would precipitate the
Absolutely.
downfall of the American empire. So that's what he said, and that is effectively ended his presidency. So that's some pretty
Yeah.
strong words, right? And Steve Bannon, of course, pointed
Yeah.
out Tulsi Gabbard was not in the room, when you're making those kind of decisions. So they were very much against it. And then when you read True Social, he posted, oh, Iran has very close to weapon of mass destruction. The old playbook that they do that all the time. But if you look at comments, a lot of MAGA people are saying, I'm not voting. I wasn't voting for you for this.
No.
Don't do this and
No.
stuff like that. So it's not like the
No.
other side is quiet. It's his own people are very much against it.
No.
But he's not listening at all.
Well, I think he is, but all it's doing is making him more and more angry. So he puts out crazy posts like I am the person who came up with America First, and I decide what that means, and everybody else must go along with me. I mean that kind of thing. And he calls Tucker Carlson. He says a cookie Tucker Carlson and that kind of thing, because he's already made that decision. That's the trouble. He made that decision secretly. He gave the Israelis the green light. He was confident they were going to win. It was all going to be very, very easy. And so the Israelis attacked, and now the battle is underway, and the Israelis haven't won. And by the way, it is left to a straight contest between Israel and Iran. The odds ultimately favor Iran because it's a very, very much bigger country. 92 million people against 9.7 million in Israel. A much, much bigger industrial base, an enormous territory, a greater ability to absorb losses, and as we see, sophisticated missile technology, which is able to penetrate the Israeli air defense system, which again, I suspect Trump was told would be able to shoot down everything that the Iranians were able to send. Because this is, by the way, this was the narrative about it that I was reading everywhere, that it was this wonderful air defense system, the best in the world. After all, it should be, given how much money has been spent on it. And as we see, it's failing. So anyway, so he was told all of this. He thought it would be easy. He gave the green light. He did this all in secret. The MAGA people only found out about it afterwards when it was too late. And now, as I said, he understands that he's in a terrible situation. But like many people, and this is unfortunately another thing I've seen, many people, when they find themselves in a situation like this, the instinct is not to retreat and admit error and confess to failure and say to people like Tucker Carlson, you were right and I was wrong. It is to double and triple and quadruple down, to reinforce failure, to join the attack, to send the missiles and the bombers and the planes into Iran, and to hope that this will achieve the great victory which was promised. And then that will somehow erase and obviate all of the mistakes that were made before.
Yeah, he's now calling Iran's unconditional surrender. So clearly,
Absolutely.
yeah, he's not.
Does he even understand what that means? I mean, but unconditional surrender. I mean, what does that even mean?
Mhm.
Exactly. Does it mean that the entire regime should capitulate
Mhm.
and be replaced by a different one? Or
Yeah.
does it just mean that they would stop nuclear enrichment? I mean, this is language of someone who is completely out of control.
And the Europeans, they are the Europeans, right? So Macron, for example, now they're always supporting Israel for their right to defend itself.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that long ago they
Yeah.
were condemn Israel for their, genocide in Gaza, but it seems like okay, they have maybe they have some sympathy for the Palestinians, but with the Iranians, they absolutely on the Israeli side. Is that the Europeans' position?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the one thing I would say is that Macron does what he always does. He comes out, he makes sophisticated statements. He says regime change in Iran would be a huge mistake, and I'm opposed to it, and all of that. Things which clearly have annoyed Trump, by the way.
Mhm.
But as always with Macron. He says these clever things, and they don't mean anything because the Europeans overall, they're just going along with this. Merz, the German chancellor, obviously supports it. I mean, he's made that absolutely clear. Keir Starmer knows that in Britain, there is strong opposition to this from many people in Britain. So he is silent, basically, but he's not taking any real action to try to restrain the Americans. I have to say the Europeans look pathetic at this business. I mean, there was supposed to be this meeting in Canada, this G7 meeting in Canada. They prepared a whole sanctions list. They set up this meeting between Trump and Zelensky. He just ignores them and walks out. And I mean, he makes them look completely powerless and entirely foolish, which is what they are. But I mean, they have put themselves in that position. I mean, they have gone along with everything America ever does, ever since Blair joined Bush in his various wars in the 1990s. And they just don't know and cannot get off this train.
Let me ask you this. If, let's say, whatever happened, let's assume in the end, either the current Iranian government saying, okay, I surrender, just tell me what to do, I'll do everything you ask me to do, or they got in a puppet regime, a puppet government. Does it mean there will be peace in the Middle East? This will be the end of it?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. It will simply create a whole new set of problems, which in the end are going to be worse than the existing problems. I mean, the way to stabilize the Middle East is by actually coming to agreements with people, not by trying to impose solutions. This is what they've been trying to do. The Americans and their friends have been trying to do in the Middle East for as long as I can remember, by the way, since before Bush. And, well, it hasn't worked. It's just making the situation there continuously violent and unstable. And it's generating more terrorism, and it's creating all sorts of further problems because, as we saw with Ted Cruz, they don't understand the Middle East. They think the Middle East is an easy place to control. It isn't. So I absolutely, it is not going to simplify or solve the problems of the Middle East. It's going to make them worse.
Yeah. Now, of course, you can understand Iran is very important for China, so there is a lot of attention paid there. Iran signed a 25 years agreement with China to provide oil for China. Not only that, less than a month ago, May 25th, so there was the first freight train, right, from Xi'an, arrived in Akron. They call it the dry port, so which is on the land, right? That route is a train route, which reduced the transit time. If you go with the sea and ocean, from 30 to 40 days to 15 days. So it's a significantly reduced that. And it's also reduced the risk of encounter bad weather or pirates, so it's a lot risky. So it's a very important train route for China to get oil, from the Middle East. The idea is not just that part from Xi'an to Akron, but also the railroad is a broader east-west corridor, which is still in the process of consolidating, which aims to link China with Iran, the Persian Gulf, Africa, and eventually even Europe. So Iran is very, very important for China. So China pays a lot of attention to what's going on there. Yeah. Now, China made it very clear that this is provoked. This is unprovoked by, Israel is attacking Iran, and so this is Israel is the aggressor. What's your take on that? The geopolitical impact for this?
Right. What do I always say? That at the bottom of every one of these problems, there is always China. And yes, I mean, there is the Israeli people who are just, Netanyahu has been obsessed by Iran for at least 40 years. I mean, by the way, people are saying that he started to talk about a Iranian bomb in 1992. They're actually wrong about that. The first articles, which were apparently to some extent inspired by Netanyahu, appeared in 1984, when he was a diplomat, an Israeli diplomat in Washington. So I mean, he's got his obsession with Iran, which is personal to him, but which is shared by a lot of sections of Israeli society. But with the United States, with the neocons, with those people, even more important is this great conflict with China, this epochal, epic battle for mastery of the world that they believe that they're engaged in. I mean, the fact that China is not involved in this battle on its side at all is something that no American that I've ever met, not even people like Professor Mearsheimer, are able to understand. They assume that because they see themselves as engaged in this great duel, China must be also. So they see that Iran has joined the BRICS, that that China brokered this agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, that China is building up all these train links and other things that you were talking about, that China's been importing a lot of Iranian oil. And they say to themselves, right, this is really dangerous. This is the keystone of the arch. If we can take out Iran, that's going to weaken China. That narrative is all over the place. Now, to say it straightforwardly, Iran is very important for China, but Iran is not critical for China. If the government in Iran were to collapse and be replaced by a pro-American government, or if the country was to descend into civil war or some deep crisis, which is possible, I mean, we don't know how it's going to turn out. Certainly, that will be something that China will have to deal with, and it will be a problem, but it will not lead to the collapse of China or the slowdown in its economic and political growth or the increase in its aggregate power. I say aggregate power because, we're talking about military power, obviously, but economic power, social power, cultural power, global influence, all of these things. This is based, again, on a completely false premise. What China wants to do is to sew together Western Asia because it makes logical sense. It wants to build up trade routes. Obviously, it wants to buy Iranian oil. It wants to develop good links with Iran because Iran is a route, as you correctly say, through to the Gulf, to the Arab states, to Africa. But China can reach these countries through other means also. It can trade with them through East Africa, for example, through Ethiopia and Somalia and those sorts of places. This is absurd to think that this is some kind of chess game. And it's an immoral way of thinking about geopolitics also. But it's the one that the Americans are obsessed with. They see everything in terms of this great geopolitical game. And they're completely wrong.
Other countries, okay. I mean, why is it so complicated? Because there's so many countries involved in this. So, for example, Pakistan. Netanyahu apparently mentioned Pakistan as a second target. Now, even Trump is not happy about that and tweeted and saying, you shouldn't bring in Pakistan. Now, of course, Pakistan very angry. According to the Daily Mail, Pakistan told Iran saying, we will, nuke Israel if Netanyahu uses nuclear weapons against Tehran.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not very comfortable with this kind of talk. Why does Netanyahu want to bring in Pakistan? Why?
Well, because he's a man obsessed, and he's getting old, and he's not in particularly good health, and his political situation in Israel is weakening, and all of Israel's wars are going wrong. And his great project, which he embarked on when he first became Prime Minister of Israel in the early 1990s, is failing. So he is. I'm sorry to say this. He is something of a fanatic on this project. And as often happens with people like that, when things start to go wrong, he is becoming increasingly reckless and deranged in what he's doing. And the trouble is, we have all of these sinister people in Washington who, instead of restraining him, are
Mhm.
backing him. And of course, that gives him an extraordinary sense of power and a belief that he can try whatever he wants. And ultimately, the Americans will always come to his
Mhm.
rescue and pull him out. And we see that in Iran, at least in this conflict in Iran, for the moment, he's probably right.
And India, on the other hand, India refused to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to condemn Israel's attack on Iran,
Yeah,
even though,
yeah,
Israel, by its own admission, saying this is preemptive, so which means it's unprovoked.
yeah,
And it's not that long ago, like I think a month ago, Iran and India just signed two memoranda of cooperation in the middle
yeah.
of the India-Pakistan war. So Iran was kind of supporting India in that, and yet here you are, India just refused to say, I'm going along with what the Shanghai Cooperation condemnation of
It,
Israel's attack. I assume every country doing things on their best, serving their best interest. What is India's calculation here?
well, it doesn't serve India's best interest. A couple of weeks ago, a couple of months ago, actually, I was speaking to an former Indian diplomat, M.K. Badrakumar, who writes a very good blog, by the way, and he's absolutely somebody worth listening and reading. Anyway, he said to me the fundamental problem with India is that everybody from the outside thinks that this is an emerging great power,
Mhm.
but really it is not. It sees everything in very, very narrow terms. It's obsessed with its feud with Pakistan,
Mhm.
and it's still hugely in awe of the United States. And it lacks the self confidence to really move forward and either to build up its own society or to conduct a proper foreign policy. So, what is happening in India, it's not difficult to understand this at all, is that Pakistan has taken a very strong position backing Iran. Pakistan bested India in these recent exchanges, this recent battle. India is very upset and very angry about that. It sees Pakistan supporting Iran, so it backs Israel. It is as simple as that. It is entirely reflective, and it has people like Badr Kuma in despair.
Yeah, and people in China saying that India basically backstabbing Iran. So that's how.
Yeah,
But here's
yeah,
the
I know,
question.
absolutely.
Yeah. So why does Iran even want to negotiate with the U.S. after all so many times they have been, cheated and promises made but not fulfilled so many times? Why does Iran even trust United States? You know,
Well,
why?
does it want to negotiate with the United States? I mean, I think this is an important point to say because I mean, I've had just a few minutes ago, just before we started, a email from a very prominent U.S. commentator. I can't name her because it's private, but she said, it'd be incredibly dangerous for Iranian diplomats or officials to come out and meet with the Americans because the Americans and the Israelis are assassinating them.
Mhm,
So all you will do is you break out of cover and they might kill you. And that's absolutely correct. They have been trying to kill Iranian officials. So on what basis do you meet with the Americans at a time when there are Israeli murder squads
yeah.
operating, trying to murder your officials? So I'm not certain there's going to be a meeting or that this meeting will happen because I'm not so sure that it's safe for Iranians to actually participate in any meeting. So I'm not sure there's going to be diplomacy. I mean, this is again something which Trump didn't understand. I think again he probably believed when he initiated all of this that after all of these blows, if the regime in Tehran didn't break, it would at the very least back down, just as he assumed that China would back down if he put 145% tariffs on it. And he assumed Russia would back down if you threatened it with sanctions, if it didn't agree to a ceasefire and all of that. And he's, again, I think, going to discover that far from this causing the Iranians to make concessions, it's going to make them very, very wary of negotiating with the Americans at all. And it's going to make them take an even harder line. I mean, it seems to me inevitable now. He demands unconditional surrender. What basis is there to negotiate after you have a demand like that?
Well, they were in the middle of a negotiation, which is why I think it's kind of got everybody off the guard, because I think the consensus was, at least, if there is a war breakout, they're supposed to happen after, I think there is a deadline, some sort of June 15th, which is, I guess, some kind of a deadline for their negotiation, if there will be something or not. So, but it happened that Israel started to, I think, assassinate Iranian high officials on the 12th, and then started bombing Iran on the 13th. I think that's what happened. Everybody was expecting something to happen after the 15th. So that's a little bit surprising. I'm just wondering why Iran even negotiating with the US in the first place. They started in April or something, right? Why do they, in particular, Trump is the one who basically just saying whatever you agreed with Obama, I'm not recognize that at all. So
no. Well, that's an excellent question. I mean, I think that there have been divisions within Iranian society and within the Iranian leadership. I think that the foreign policy and military and security people have always been deeply suspicious of any kind of negotiation with the Americans. But then what happened last year was that the former president of Iran, Ebrahim Raisi, was killed. And I'm now very suspicious. I was suspicious about that death when it happened, and I've become even more suspicious about it since. I remember we discussed it, by the way, and I remember you telling me that in Chinese netizens were pretty suspicious about it. But then the Iranians pretended or claimed or said that it was all an accident. Maybe it was. But anyway, Raisi was then replaced by this much more moderate secular figure, this doctor, who I think most people think is, a good person, but he seemed to think that the way forward for Iran was to try and improve relations with the West. That there was going to be, he's against Iran having nuclear weapons. He's taken this sort of position. So I think this has created instability within the Iranian political system, which hadn't been there whilst Raisi was in power. And again, one has to say this reflects a mood within some sections of Iranian society, which have wanted to gradually secularize and to open up relations with the West. I don't think that they are, overwhelming. I don't think this is a critical mass of people. But anyway, the fact was Pezeshkian won the election. I know it's a terrible mistake. I think that, as you absolutely rightly said, it just opened the door for all of these things that we have now seen. And it has made Iranian responses much, much more difficult. So I think Pezeshkian has been a consistent voice for negotiations with the Americans. And I think that what he's discovering gradually, though he still hasn't fully come to terms with this, is that you are not able to negotiate with somebody who wants to destroy you.
Overall, can we say this, that China wants peace? Because peace has been good for China. China's rise has been peaceful, right? So to have trade relations with everybody, you need peace, okay, to develop, etc. U.S., can we say now, U.S. wants wars and conflicts and chaos and instabilities everywhere in the world? Maybe not within the United States. Even that, I'm not so sure, because look at the very chaotic within the United States too. But at this point, the U.S. wants all these things. Can we say that's the huge difference between the two countries?
Well, absolutely. I would nuance it a little. I don't think it's that China wants peace because peace has been good for China. I think China wants peace because China realizes that peace is good. And because it is good, it is good for China. Not just good for China, but good for everybody. I think China understands that peace is by definition good. This is not just Xi Jinping and his officials. It is, I think, a fundamental understanding that exists within Chinese society. It is there in its DNA. I mean, I've discussed this many times. I'm not going to repeat myself here. But I think that is absolutely what China is about. They always want peace because they understand that it is only through peace that countries prosper in the long term. The United States is completely different. It is all about not peace, not even war exactly. It is about power. It's constantly obsessed with power because it comes from a European culture. It's a creation. It's created out of a European culture that is obsessed with power and war. Can I just say, there's a just to get a sense of what the Western mindset is. We have in Britain a very famous poet called Rudyard Kipling, who was the great poet of the British Empire, and he once wrote a poem in which he said, "There are only four things that matter, the four great things," as he put it, and these were women, horses, power, and war. So that is in our DNA. That's our DNA. Acquisition, because that's what the first two things are all about, power and war. And that is what the United States is. It finds it very difficult to think in any other way. Now, that is the problem. So yes, China always promotes policies of peace because that is its nature. The United States always promotes complex geostrategic strategies. It's obsessed with, using, appearing tough, taking military action, killing enemies, peace through strength, as they say, which is, of course, a contradiction in terms, because that is its DNA. That is what it is.
I just read that Shoigu is now visiting North Korea. So what's going on there? Is North Korea going to be more involved in the Ukraine war now?
Well, I think they will be, but I think it probably goes much further than this, in that clearly there's now this relationship between Russia and North Korea that is developing. And I obviously haven't been to North Korea, and I don't expect that I will at any time soon. But I understand that the economy there is now starting to gain momentum because they're starting to import a great deal of energy and other raw material products from Russia, and the Russians are now doing deals with North Korea to rebuild various North Korean factories so that they can provide both weapons but also consumer goods to Russia, because Russia has a labor shortage. And I've also heard reports that North Korean guest workers are starting to work increasingly in Russian factories in the Far East. It needs to be stressed. This is still, it's only a fraction of the trade between China and North Korea, but it's enough to make this attractive to North Korea. And of course, it is very beneficial to Russia because, as I said, they do have this labor shortage. And North Korean workers are apparently very well trained and very disciplined, and they work hard, and they're able to produce these things and produce them well.
Okay, let's talk about G7. First of all, do you think a G7 is still relevant? I don't even pay much attention.
I was going to ask the question. I mean, does it even exist? I mean, this meeting that took place in Canada was, well, maybe it wasn't the event that finally killed the G7, but the leader of the country, the most powerful country in the G7 by far, the United States, is clearly uninterested in it.
Yeah.
I mean, he's incredibly insulting. He says, why isn't Russia here? Why isn't China here? That was interesting as well. Why aren't they here? Why am I wasting my time, in other words, talking to inconsequential people, which is who you are? And he spends a few hours there, clearly bored, and as I said, probably getting increasingly angry, and then he stalks off. And then we have this whole debate: is he going to sign the final communique, or is he not going to sign the final? Anyway, all of this. So I mean, to me, it didn't just look like an irrelevance. It looked like a zero, actually. It has absolutely no meaning or reality anymore.
And yeah, I also noticed that Trump said, "Why isn't Russian is not invited back?" And if you invite China, I'll be fine with that, or that's a good idea, something like that. But I wonder, I don't think Putin is even interested. Maybe at one point Russian was, but I don't think Putin is interested at all. And Xi Jinping right now is attending the second China Central Asia Summit in Astana. So they are busy. I don't think they care about the G7 at all.
Well, the Russians have been repeatedly saying if they get an invitation to rejoin the G7, they will refuse it. They don't want to have anything to do with it anymore. By the way, and I think this is an important thing to say, the Russians, for the Russians, the G8 was a completely humiliating experience because, contrary to what many people believe, the G7 continued alongside the G8. So Russia was invited along and would attend the meetings. And firstly, there would be 2 days of meetings of the G7 states, the Americans and their friends. And then on the final day, in the last couple of hours, the Russians would be allowed into the room and told what all of the others had agreed. Apparently, the Russians got more and more angry about this and more frustrated. And as I very well remember, I think it was in 2013, Putin decided to stay away. So, I mean, he sent Medvedev instead. I mean, he refused himself to go. So the Russians are not going back. Xi Jinping has a far more important meeting to do with the Central Asian leaders. These are real business meetings. I mean, meetings where actual work is done. The G7 is just now formulaic ritual that nobody takes seriously. You can see that from these enormous communiques that they publish. They're really entirely empty of any real content.
They invited the MBS, the Saudi, and he refused to come too. He found some excuses. He said it's too busy here.
Yeah, well, I can imagine.
Yeah. So all the important people, right? That I can see why Trump is bored.
Well, if Trump was fully committed to it and the United States is fully engaged in it, perhaps some more important people might come because obviously they might want to speak to him. But they're not going to waste their time traveling all the way to Canada to meet with Starmer and Macron and Merz and people like that. I mean, it's and that's something that Europeans need to understand, which of course they never will.
No. Now, Trump also faced some domestic challenges, like his military parade. And then it's not very, I don't know, what is your overall impression about his military? Some people call it parade, but what's your impression?
I thought it was a dismal thing. I mean, to me, I mean, I've watched the Chinese army march, on Tiananmen, and you see the soldiers in perfect harmony with each other. You see the Russians, so they put on impressive parades. And then you see the North Koreans, my God, they put on extremely impressive parades. And then you see this so-called parade, soldiers who slouch and can't really march. I thought it was a dismal performance. I mean, it demonstrated the extent of America's military decay, actually. Far from showcasing the greatest military in the world, it demonstrated the extent to which it's in decline.
And it's a typical Trump that he's making money out of it. He's selling
Absolutely.
tickets, putting advertisement in between. I mean, it's typical Trump. He would do something like that.
Absolutely, I completely agree. By the way, it's not just the American army that's going through this decline. We have every year in Britain a major military parade, which is called the Trooping of the Colour, which is
Okay.
goes back to the 18th century. Just if you go on YouTube, go and see how that parade was performed in the 1930s. There's this film from 1933, in the 1960s, and compare it with today. I mean, as recently as the 60s, I mean, it was incredibly sharp and tight. Today, you could see it's a shadow of what it was, and that's the reality of militaries in the West altogether. Reflective of a decline of confidence in their own societies.
Yeah, I mean, in the meantime, when there was a military parade, there was also thousands of protests that they call it "No King"
Yeah.
protests,
Oh,
and protests has been going on for the United States. It seems like a different reasons, right? The first they were supporting Palestinians and anti-genocide protest, and then still ongoing protest ICE, right? That to capture in illegal immigrants and that kind of a protest and even become violent. And now anti-Trump, I guess, no king
yeah.
protest. It's just constant protest now. And also on top of that, there's
Yes.
also very weird two lawmakers was murdered in Minnesota. I mean, what's going on here in the
Yeah.
US?
Well, everything's. I mean, first of all, just to come back to your point about Trump cashing in on his own parade, I mean, this is. It's not insignificant. It is not unimportant. It is playing a role in the deepening cynicism and anger that you're starting to see spread across U.S. society. And of course, it's not as if Trump is the only person who is doing that. The entire political class is doing that. And Trump is making his position even worse by starting a war against Iran. If he starts a war against Iran and it continues for a long time, like the Vietnam War did, against an existing backdrop of more and more protests, well, you can very easily see how this could quickly get out of control, and we could see an explosion of protests across the United States, which perhaps even Trump's own original electoral base coming out against him. So,
Mhm.
this is a very, very tense situation. But the reason we're seeing so many protests in the United States is because the society is fracturing. It is becoming more and more unstable. There is loss of trust in American institutions. There is a loss of belief in the political class. The Trump phenomenon is a reflection of that.
Mhm.
And when that happens and normal political avenues no longer function, you start to see protests. Now, protests are common in the United States. That's a feature of the political system. And also, we have to be cynical about some of these protests. They're
Yeah.
clearly organized by the usual people. And some of these protests, especially the ones in California, I
Mhm.
have no doubt at all, I can't prove this, but I have no doubt at all that there are actually criminal gangs also
Mhm.
involved.
Mhm.
I've seen this happen in many places that when they see law enforcement agents coming into their territories, they organize riots to try to push these people out. So there are all of these different elements coming together, but the aggregate story is of the decline of authority of the state.
Mhm.
The institutions of the state are no longer trusted. They no longer have authority. They no longer have effective enforcement. And there is a genuine loss of belief. Um, I'm not saying that the United States is on the brink of civil war or anything like that.
Mhm.
Thank goodness. But as I said, this is all a very, very bad sign. It's very different, by the way, from the protests I remember, I'm old enough to remember them, in the 1960s, which had radical political causes behind them. The Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, things of that kind. There is nothing like that level of political activism in the United States today. And that makes these protests ultimately more dangerous.
Don't you think in general, I think protest, some people are very proud that in the West you can, freely to protest, and then people do protest all the time, and then you don't see that much kind of that kind of a protest in China. I personally feel this way, that protesting for me is like you're almost like your last way of solving a problem. Because if there is a problem, if I am not happy with something, I think there should be some kind of a process and mechanism that I can express to somebody of importance, and that somebody would collect all these unhappiness and then start some of these discussions and trying to figure out some way to resolve the problems. There should be a process.
Yes.
When people protest, that means I have a trouble, I have a problem, but it doesn't get solved, and I don't know what else I can do other than go protest. Isn't protest itself is a sign of desperation and the out of options?
Yeah, it's a sign of societal breakdown, which is what we're starting to see. I mean, it's a sign of the breakdown of the political consensus. You're absolutely right. I mean, protest on the kind of scale that we're seeing now is a product of a political system that is breaking down and is no longer becoming responsive to the signals from below. Trump was elected to keep the United States out of war. He's about to lead the United States into a war against an adversary he knows very little about.
Yeah. Okay, so what is the Britain's reaction to this Boeing 787 down? Because it is a flight from Delhi to London, right? Is there any reaction there?
Yes, it was huge news here. Of course, nobody says the unmentionable thing that this is another Boeing aircraft and a new one. And one wonders exactly what is wrong. But this isn't something people want to talk about. But it did attract a huge amount of attention. And of course, there's a very big Indian community here in Britain, and some of these very law-abiding one, by the way. Some of these people are wealthy, and they're well connected in British life. It has been a profound shock altogether.
Okay, just one more thing you need to pay attention. We need to pay attention is tomorrow is the deadline for the TikTok ban. Again, that Trump extended the second time. So now he was asked about this. He said, is he going to give another extension? He said probably, yeah. But it's tomorrow, it's clicking, so we don't know. Why do you think he's still not just giving a final say, whether either you just shut it down or saying, okay, whatever you have done satisfies my belief that you are safe, you're not putting the national security risk there with your data, what have you. So let's move on. Why is he still hanging there, still dangling there, extension? Do you think he still thinks this is the bargaining chips when he's negotiating?
Yeah, he does. He does.
Okay.
He lacks what the Russians call the power of decision. I mean, the ability to make decisions, clear, consistent decisions, to set out a policy and to stick with it, and to go on making decisions consistent with that policy day after day after day, week after week after week, which, by the way, Xi Jinping absolutely does. I mean, the made in China thing is a case in point. The improvement of pollution of the cities. These things don't happen by themselves. You don't simply write a decree and expect it to happen. You have to have meetings every day. You follow up. You see this through. That's, as the Russians call that, the power of decision. Trump absolutely does not have that. He's constantly thinking of himself as this great deal maker. He's going to do these big trades, and he's worried that if he does TikTok, then he's going to give away his leverage. He's obsessed with leverage, and he doesn't understand that China isn't interested in leverage. I mean, and that negotiations between great nations, China and the United States, do not revolve around leverage. They revolve around trying to discover common ground and common interests in order to move things forward. It's not something that he understands at all. And I doubt that anybody could ever explain it to him. I mean, if you and I got him into a room and tried to explain it to him over many, many hours, he would still go away and start doing exactly the same thing as he always does. So I think that's the trouble. As I said, he doesn't have that ability to form a policy, to create a policy, and to work it out and to see it through. The tariff policy is another example. I mean, if the United States wants to move to a policy of protectionism, you may think that is good, or you may think that is bad, but it's a policy, and you can work towards it, and you can build a consensus around it, and you can build the structures to create it, and you can do it. But of course, he's not. He's putting up tariffs one day, bringing them down the next, getting into trouble with the courts. I mean, it's all over the place. And it's the same with TikTok. As I said, he doesn't have that ability to settle on a policy and see it through.
I think you're right. Even though China repeatedly, not just saying it, but through its action, like if you want to shut it down, shut it down. We are not going to sell it. I mean, they made it very, very clear. I mean, there's a law in China saying if a company has, important high-tech technology, you cannot sell it. So for TikTok, the algorithm is regarded as the sensitive technology. So it's simply illegal for TikTok to sell.
Yeah.
But I mean, China did it, said it multiple times. It seems like they don't get it. They don't seem believing.
No,
is not interested.
They don't take no for an answer. Just as Trump won't understand that the Russians don't want to rejoin the G8. I mean, it's something he just can't get his head round. But that, by the way, he's not unique in the West in this. Westerners in general always find it difficult to understand that when others say no, they mean no.
Yeah. And that's the problem. They just don't accept it. Yeah. That's really fundamentally lots of times that's the problem, that they don't accept it.
Exactly.
Okay. I mean, I'm sure there was a whole bunch of things that will happen in between. We will see. Thank you so much.
Well, we could very well find the United States in war. Very likely.
Yeah. Okay.
Anyway, there we are. Have a very good week. And Sophia, we'll see each other next week.
Okay. Thank you so much. Bye. Okay.